Welcome to the Jewish Studies Center class on Return to the Catskills. We're very happy to see that there are so many of you. There's about 380 some people watching this live presentation, and it's a new record for us, so we're very happy about that. The talk today will be by Phil Brown, who is the world's greatest expert on the Catskills. After his talk, our Vice President, Mindy Reiser, will take questions from the chat box, consolidate them, ask them to Phil. Meanwhile, I'll begin with the introduction. My name is Jerry Garfinkel. I'm the treasurer of the Jewish Studies Center, and I'm from the Catskills myself. So we're going to start by having me tell you a little bit about my portion of the Catskills. It all began in a small hamlet, Loch Sheldrick, New York, small hamlet in the Catskills, Sullivan County, New York. In the loch, as some of you know, is the Scottish word for lake. So Loch Sheldrick is named after Lake Sheldrick. At the bottom of the lake, there had been a hotel whose name I don't really know what the official name was, but it was always called Hans Hotel. Back in 1939, a young 24-year-old young lady came to the hotel in the summer, and she was assigned a room. She was not very happy about it. So she complained to Mr. Hahn, and she kept complaining. He was not very happy. So he got upset, and then he saw one of his waiters walking by. He said, "Hey, Joe, come over here. Take this lady rowing on the lake. Do something with her. Get it out of my hair." So Joe took her rowing on the lake and married her. Well, 18 months later, I was born. So that's my beginning in the Catskills. When I was about 5, my parents, Joe and Rose, actually rented Hans Hotel for the summer, and they ran it themselves. And then next few years, they ran other hotels. They rented and ran other hotels in the same area in the middle of Loch Sheldrick. Then after that, my father then bought a hotel about 2 miles away called the Edgewood Hotel. Well, since it had new owners, he renamed it the New Edgewood Hotel. And the hotel was near Hilldale Pond, another lake, again, about 2 miles from Sheldrake Lake. And at the north end of the Hilldale Pond was a much larger hotel called the Black Apple. And about a year after my parents bought the New Edgewood, new people bought the Black Apple and renamed it as Charles and Lillian Brown's Hotel. That's a very famous hotel. For example, the movie Dirty Dancing is based on that hotel, supposedly. My parents ran the New Edgewood, and they owned it and ran it for about 30 years. So my sister and I kind of grew up there. Notice on the lake, we left Browns out of the lake. This is an artist's rendition of the hotel. There are a lot of boats. One of my jobs was managing the boats. Now, our hotel, and most of the hotels in the Catskills, were really noted for 2 things. One was food. You know, you can order food for lunch. You can order a second, order a third. You can eat, and then eat some more. And the second thing that was famous for all the hotels, most of the hotels, at least, we had a lot of entertainment. Our most famous entertainer was Fivish Finkel. Now, he wasn't that famous when he worked for us, but later on he became famous. He was a star in the TV series Picket Fences, and also later on in the TV series Boston Public, about a public high school in Boston, of course. And in the movies, the Coen brothers, A Serious Man, the first scene in that movie is basically Fivish. Fivish stood with us, worked for, as on staff for a whole summer for about 2 or 3 years. We had other entertainers also. On the staff was Anna Lubin and Florence Weiss, who were singers. Anna Lubin was a very short lady, and she would do a skit with Five-ish a few times a week. Five-ish was a very, very tall man, and Anna was a very short lady, and they'd hug each other, and it was very comical. Most of our people came from the Yiddish theater. The exception was Henny Youngman. We had him once for Labor Day weekend. He was Jewish, but he wasn't from the Yiddish theater. Molly Picon and Aaron Levidoff were two of the most famous singers from the Yiddish theater. Freda Ursha was also a famous singer in Yiddish theater. Her brother, Moshe Ursha, which is a very nice name, was a very, very famous cantor. And he also was the former husband of Florence Weiss. Now, how does all this relate to Phil Brown and the rest of the Catskills? Well, I don't know whether I don't think whether Phil's parents met, I don't know whether they met in the Catskills or not. They might have. But they did one year rent a hotel like my parents did and ran it themselves. It wasn't the famous Brown's Hotel, of course, a different Brown's Hotel. But what they would do is they would rent and run concessions, a small store in each of the hotels that they're in, where you buy like a snack, ice cream or a soda, candy, maybe a toothbrush, or some that sort. So in some sense, Phil also was partially brought up in the Catskills. Now, Phil is the founder and the president of something called the Catskill Institute, which works to record and remember the whole history of the Catskills with conferences, public speaking, scholarly research, and actually collecting as much materials as they can. And they have the world's largest archive of Catskill materials. You can visit it on their website. And for 13 years, he ran an annual conference about the history of the Catskills, and it was on Labor Day weekend. He's also written or edited 3 different books on the Catskills. He currently is the University Distinguished Professor of Sociology and Health Science at Northeastern University, and he's the director of the Social Science Environmental Health Research Institute there, and is also on the executive committee of the Jewish Studies program. Okay, so take it away, Phil.
Guten Abend. In dem Herzen von den Jiden, die Catskills, seien ein süßer Teil von unserer Sikon und unserer Geschichte. In die Catskills, wir haben gehabt, wir haben Glück und Freiheit. Heint, wir kommen in einem, als die Jahre sollen leben, in unser Herzen und Schommen. Oh, you didn't tell me this would be a lecture in Yiddish. It's all right, I'll translate. In the hearts of the Jews, the Catskills is a sweet part of our memory and our history. In the Catskills, we had a community, we had happiness and freedom. Today, we come together so that those years can live in our hearts and souls. Nu, take a seat and enjoy. And if you can guess the hotel where this chair is, I will send you there for a vacation for Pesach. And if you don't believe that, look what you missed. My job here is to show you everything that you missed tonight. So I grew up in the Catskills where my parents and I worked our whole lives. After my mother died in 1991, 19 years after my father, I began to explore my roots, and I discovered they were thoroughly in the Catskills. I put my own memories on paper. I interviewed 126 Catskills veterans, collected archival material, made research excursions back to my home turf, and re-immersed myself in a culture that I'd been away from for just a decade. And the result was this first book, Catskill Culture, A Mountain Rat's Memories of the Great Jewish Resort Area. It was a combination of my stories and an overall history. I got hooked and I couldn't stop doing this. And so then I next did a book called In the Catskills, which was a collection of work by myself and many other people. It had fiction, it had nonfiction, it even had music, including music written specifically about the Catskills. And I actually myself have written a song about the Catskills. And we had people in there ranging from Abraham Kahan to Isaac Bashevis Singer, other classic writers, all the way up to modern fiction and scholarship. Along the way, and then I did this book more recently, Summer Haven, The Catskills, the Holocaust, and the Literary Imagination, which is also a collection. It's very interesting because we have people who wrote about the Catskills during and after the Holocaust, and those of them who were alive then revisited their work many decades later. And if they were no longer with us, their friends or relatives contributed to that. And plus, my co-editor and I, Holly Levitsky, did original research to look at the history of the Catskills in this period. Along the way, doing all this, I set up an institute called the Catskills Institute, and it was a place that would develop a huge archive, which grows and grows. And I must say, as I always do in these talks, the success of this archive is people like you who will send photographs and postcards and rate cards and matchbooks and the towels that accidentally got into your suitcase when you packed up to leave. These are the kind of things that really help us to create a huge archive. And you could see this at the address below. We also did a newsletter, and we have on the website enormous amount of things, not just the donations, but fiction and poetry and materials from all over the place. So this became something I got very hooked on. As I said, I wrote music about the Catskills. I wrote 5 or 6 short stories. And really, this became a manifold attempt to preserve this incredibly rich legacy. And I invite you tonight to come live it with me. So I grew up in a family of mountain rats. And by the way, these are the kind of things we did. We had these conferences. We ran them for 13 years straight. And a lot of these materials are available on the website, and you can actually buy tapes of the talks that were given there. So these were places where almost anybody who had written about the Catskills, who had made films about the Catskills, all came to speak about that. So I grew up in the Catskills in this family of mountain rats. Mountain rats were people who were so hooked on the mountains, they couldn't leave. Even when they were too tired, they were too worn out, they'd worked themselves to death, they would still go back year after year. And my parents began in 1946 as the owners of a small hotel called Brown's Hotel Royal on White Lake. And they had that hotel since that time until 1952, not very long, 6 years. But after that, they worked for others all their lives. My mother, always a chef, my father having various jobs, running concessions, working as a maitre d', working as a chauffeur. This is my mother in the kitchen at the Seven Gables. She was very proud of her work. And this is her at Chate's Hotel. Sorry, these slides have a mind of their own sometimes. This is her at Chate's Hotel in Accord some years later. She carried around with her all her life in her purse these clippings from the New York Post. And you may be surprised to know that the New York Post was actually once a newspaper. And it was also considered the entertainment newspaper. And in this particular column, they would highlight different places. And so she had circled, menu magic, baked chicken at the Cafe Grinzing, but Sylvia Brown's baked eggplant Milanese at the Seven Gables Hotel in Greenfield Park. Again, another version of this column some years later. My father was a maitre d', and this is a place where he was caught wearing this very shiny gray sharkskin suit with a ridiculous pink tie. This is how maitre d's dressed, actually, in certainly a lot of the small hotels. In the bigger hotels, they might even wear tuxes, but not my father. Some years earlier, actually, we think he had been partners in a small hotel up in the northern Catskills near Fleischman's, but nobody in the family ever really could figure out exactly when or where. But mountain rats, as I said, they went back to the mountains even when they shouldn't. And my parents were doing this from Florida. After they lost their hotel in 1952, they decided to try something new, and they moved down to Fort Pierce, a little town 150 miles or so north of Miami. And the idea here is that they would get a new start here, and that all of the Jews coming down to go to Miami Beach would be so hungry for good New York food by the time they got to Florida that they would stop in here on the way. Now, my parents, having lost a hotel because they were not good business people, did not do well running restaurants. So this restaurant went broke. But they were foolish and they started again. And then they decided that they would try Brown's Jewish restaurant. Now, this is a town where the Klan is still parading, where Jews are experiencing lots of anti-Semitism. What a crazy idea to have Brown's Jewish restaurant. And indeed, they got into trouble because they had the nerve to serve a Black family that stopped there, not knowing that this was a thing that one did not do in Florida unless the sign said colored restaurant. It was a very important lesson for me as I learned about it later for the rest of my political life. Eventually, they got smart and they said, this is not working, let's go south. So they found their way down to Miami Beach, and they ran the coffee shop at the Haddon Hall Hotel here. Beautiful Art Deco, like many of the places in South Beach. This was partly owned by the Kutcher family. And there were indeed many hotels in Florida that were jointly owned by some of the families in the Catskills. The work that they did in the hotel was endless, day in, day out. Somehow my father at some point found a time where he could sit still in a chair here. But I don't know how this happened because people usually worked all the time. This is me at a volleyball net, my father and I in front of the proverbial canna garden that almost every hotel had with white painted stones around it. Another one to give you a sense of the size of how tall those cannons were. But they did not ever really want to talk much about the hotel, and they certainly didn't show me things like this. This was a postcard I'd only found when my mother died. It was in her wallet. And for some reason, she kept it there along with those New York Post clippings, but never took it out. And all of the years that I asked them about the hotel, they would simply say, it's gone. But nothing to tell me more about it. And I longed to know about it. And I thought, somehow, someday I will find it. Very small hotel on the shores of White Lake. And here's a close-up of it. And try to focus on this because we'll come back to this in a little bit of architectural history as we progress through the talk tonight. When I decided to learn about the Catskills, which was what we learn about. I knew about it because I lived there so many years. But going back there to do the book, I said, I'm going to find this hotel, no matter what it takes. And I assume, like every hotel, it is either burned down or fallen down or been demolished. And I was very surprised to find that indeed it was thriving. It had been sold several times to different people. And it looked a little bit different. The old stucco siding was covered up. The clapboards replaced it, and it had been turned into the Bradstand Country Inn, and much more beautiful than the old hotel. But they displayed pictures of the old hotel that they had accumulated over the years from people who had visited, and their friends would make them not only photographs but ceramic pieces of the hotel, which they would have on display. They had turned the hotel into a very kind of turn of the century, almost Victorian looking place. It didn't look like a 1950s Catskill hotel. And every 2 rooms had been turned into 1, which meant that the rooms were still very small. They were very glad to see me. They couldn't believe that somebody walked in the door and said, my parents used to own this hotel. Tell me about it. And they started to dig around and they found handwritten menus that my mother had written. And, you know, it is something, of course, you instantly recognize your parents' handwriting. And this was the menu, handwritten, because there were only 4 or 5 tables. It was a small hotel, so they would not be able to afford a mimeograph machine to make these menus. And, you know, it's a very small menu with not that many choices. They even found a rate card. And this is giving you a sense of how inexpensive it was. This was Decoration Day. For those of you who are not New Yorkers, Decoration Day is called by other people Memorial Day, but in New York, it's Decoration Day. Why? Because we put decorations on the graves of the dead soldiers. But for that whole Decoration Day weekend, you could stay for as little as $22.50. And if you wanted to spend another $2.50, you could get the best room in the house. It was a place where the family came to work, the family came to stay, and no one could tell the difference if they were working or staying. And this is partly why my parents went broke. People thought they would have a job there and they didn't really do much work. This is my father's sister and her husband, foolishly well dressed as if they were going out for dinner, but walking up the stairs from the lake. These were the cousins on the lawn in front of the proverbial concession where one bought snacks all day. More cousins in front of the handball court. And my cousin Gloria, the daughter of the couple you saw before, my aunt and uncle, walking down the stairs, dressed beautifully also like her parents in the middle of the day. And having a sense that this was like walking down the promenade of a beautiful ballroom. And it was just a very small, modest hotel. Years later, when I went back, I took my family. I took my wife, my children, my mother-in-law, and my mother-in-law's sister. And I would actually go back and 1 year stay in the hotel and write an essay about it called Sleeping in My Parents' Catskills Hotel. They weren't good business people. You've heard that story already. This was the deed when they bought the hotel in 1946. And this is the deed when they lost it in 1952 to foreclosure. So that really was the end of the Catskills experience for them as hotel owners. And now they would go in years and years of working for other people. And I was, of course, too young at the time to learn from them about the hotel business at the Royal, but I did at the Seven Gables. And at the Seven Gables, I was able to spend 6 years there. So by the time I finished, I knew everything about how to put salads together, how to sell soda and beer in the dining room at night, how to work behind a concession, and to serve food, to do short order cooking and everything else. But this was a very modest little hotel. One of the reasons it was modest is because the only place my mother could get a job as a chef, because of the sexism in those days, was big hotels didn't hire women as chefs. Here's a picture of what the hotel looked like, as you can tell from the cars earlier on. The building on the left is called the White House. There was always, in these little hotels, the main house and often the White House. And what looks to be like a pretty ramshackle wooden building to the right of it is the children's dining room. Beyond that is the kitchen and the main dining room. And what you see on the right, those stairs lead up to the casino. The casino was not a gambling casino, but it was the entertainment hub of the hotel. This is a postcard by the wonderful postcard artist, Alfred Landis. We'll visit him later. And one of the things about Landis is he would do these fake aerials. He would, sketch the hotel in front, and then he would go back to his studio in Wurtsboro and he would render it as if he was taking a photo from the air. And these were the postcards that one often saw in the 50s and 60s. And Landis was a stickler for detail. In some of these postcards, he would even have ping pong tables with the rackets and the ping pong balls. But he also took his cue from the hustling entrepreneurial spirit of the owners, who would say to him, Alfred, we had a good summer, and what we're going to do as soon as we close up after the holidays, we're going to build a new building. And I want you to put that on the postcard. And so Landis goes back and he invents a building here, okay? This building never, ever existed, but the owner said it would exist next season. And the idea, by sending these postcards to guests and potential guests, they would recruit more business. Again, that's the main house you see in the background. This is the White House you saw before, the kitchen, the dining rooms, and the casino. This is a building called the Bungalow, not as a bungalow colony, but because it was a small building with just 6 or 8 rooms. Most everything, it's not to scale, but it's pretty accurate as to what was there. All the way in the back here is the staff quarters, and here is the tennis court, the handball court, the swimming pool, all the things that you would expect a little hotel to have. Here's the view of the main house. It's a different kind of decoration. It's what we call fake Tudor. It's a different architecture than the other, which was often called Catskills Mission architecture. There's a picture of my mother with some relatives in front of the casino. My father, who ran that casino concession for a while, and my cousin Roberta here, and some of the other dining room staff on the lawn next to the main house. And me in front of the casino. I was always a bit of a ham, and I was very eager at the tender young age of perhaps 8 to get on stage like everybody else and play the drums, which I actually never learned to do. That's the way it looked when I went back as I started my excursion to revisit my life there and to go and visit every hotel that my parents and I ever worked at. And that's the casino, the bungalow I mentioned before, 6 little rooms. And all the way in the back, at the right, you see the children's day camp. The ham I was, some years later when I was working at the Commodore Hotel, my first year of college in Swan Lake. This was me after hours, pretending that I was also an entertainer. So the memories of all this stuff rooted around in my head for years and years, and I didn't realize how important this was, not just to me, but to so many other people. And I realized that these powerful memories were going to be something I would share, not just in books, but by talking to people like you and by assembling the archives and everything else. So here we have a map. This is really just Sullivan County, and what it is missing, of course, is the part of Ulster County over here, which is also part of the Catskills. Now, the Catskills, of course, is historically and geographically a much larger area. We're talking about the Jewish Catskills. But it was a place that from the end of the 19th century until the 1970s, about an endless number of people came. By the high point of the Catskills in the 50s and 60s, about 500,000 people every summer. Imagine that. This was the world's single largest resort area. And it gave shape to not just hotels, but bungalow colonies and camps. It was a place for workers to eke out a living. It was a way to preserve cultural and religious affinities for guests who could go away either to the glamorous large hotels or the very small ones or the bungalow colonies. They could get away from the drudgery of a year's work. They could find romance, and they could have a proper vacation like regular Americans, but in a very Jewish milieu. And these places were not just resorts, but they were really miniature societies where people knew lots about each other and created very intimate relationships. They were family-based, they were neighborhood-based. The Seven Gables, which I've talked about a lot, people spoke of it as a Jackson Heights hotel because most of the people who worked and lived there came from Jackson Heights and Queens, because the owners came from there and they recruited from there. And they went around with their own bodies and with the bodies of people called solicitors, people who got a cut of each guest's rate if they brought them as a new guest to the hotel. And they would go to the Shuls and they would go to the clubs, and they would go to the PTAs and wherever else they could drum up business. And people like this, with this entrepreneurial spirit, created this resort land where they imported Second Avenue vaudeville and the humor and the music, the culinary customs, the Yiddishkeit, and everything about Jewish life that this resort area could have. And it was something that would linger in people's memories for a very, very long time. And that's why you're here tonight, because you still know about it, and some of you lived it. How did you get up there? Well, most people didn't have cars. They took the train. They took the O&W, the Ontario and Western Railroad, often called the Old and Weary. And in the early days, you were met at the station by horse-drawn wagons. A few years later, in the 20s, you were met by old Model Ts. Manville Wakefield, who was a very eminent historian of the Catskills, loved to draw the powerful locomotive. You see the logo there in the front of it, of the O&W. The O&W also published summer homes among the mountains, and this was the way that you advertised hotels. And this is as early as 1920. Now, the first Jewish resort is not until the 1890s. But even into the 1920s, there are tons of Gentile resorts there. And when one opens this very beautiful, glossy, highly polished printed brochure of 50, 60 pages, one saw two kinds of ads. One said, churches nearby, that meant no Jews allowed. And the other said, dietary laws observed. Why we didn't say kosher? Were we embarrassed? Did we really think that people didn't know dietary laws meant kosher and that we were Jews? But nevertheless, we had our own hidden language. We went up on not just the O&W, but also the Ulster and Delaware Railroad. And because so many of this people at this time still were primarily Yiddish speakers, the Ontario and Western Railroad printed its rate schedules in Yiddish. And the hotels also advertised in Yiddish. There were several Yiddish newspapers in New York City at the time. And they kind of made a hodgepodge. Some of this is Yiddish and some of this is English, just translated into Yiddish. So let us take, for example, up on top here, the Prospect Inn. Okay, one would understand that you would spell out prospect in Yiddish. But if you were really in a Yiddish newspaper, you'd say Prospect Kretschmer. No, but no, it says inn. It's transliterated into the English word inn. The other way you got up there was the hack. And here, this is an old advertisement that was still on the side of a building in Queens into the 1990s. It just had never been taken down. It was still there. And Goldie's Mountain Line was the biggest of the hacks. These were very large limousines that packed a lot of people in and endless suitcases on top. And it was kind of unbelievable that you could actually squeeze that many people into a car. Along the way, it's not far, and granted the traffic was slow in those days, but you had to stop at the Red Apple Rest on the way. And where you went was to this magical place that somehow people had created out of nothing. Started with farms and boarding houses and chicken farms in particular. This is an old abandoned chicken farm that I took a photo of. And many of the farmers who were pioneers back in the early years were still around. And this is a very healthy couple. If you were managing to survive into your late 80s like these folks, you had to be healthy. And look at them. They don't look like they're that old because farmers, either died young or they lived a long life because they just had the survivor instinct in them. And this is a couple that were old enough that they didn't farm the land, but they rented it out to people. In the specialty area of Catskill studies, we even have specialty books like Jewish Farmers of the Catskills. It's a very wonderful book. And look at that center photo. This is a shul that we will look at later when we talk about the shuls of the Catskills. But people started out in old boarding homes. These are mid to late 19th century buildings that were taking in boarders because the farmers realized they couldn't do very much on their own. It was very hard to make a living there. The land was too poor to really grow a lot of crops. So what they mainly did was they grew chickens and they grew milk from cows. This is what they could grow. And some of the hotels that would start out very small later became big. And they developed something called a kochelein, cook for yourself. And the idea here is that instead of having to take boarders in and cook for them, you would simply rent them a room and they would get 2 burners on the stove and a shelf in the ice box, not refrigerators yet, but ice boxes. And they would bring their family and sit at their own table in the dining room and cook their own meal. There actually were a few of these left, even as late as the 60s or 70s, but it was a very old-fashioned form of life up there. Nevertheless, the remnants of them are still there. This is another one. These often became bungalow colonies because they got the idea that, we don't want to cook for other people. Now they're cooking in our own building. Now we'll just build a lot of bungalows. They can go cook in the other buildings. They did not provide the wealth of entertainment. They didn't provide a children's day camp. What they did was they put a couple of planks on an old water heater, and that was what the kids played on. And if they wanted more adventure, they could sit at a little table on the lawn, or to even be more adventurous, they could sit on the farmer's tractor. And there were no swimming pools. That's why most of these early hotels and bungalow colonies were situated along the banks of the Neversink River, because it was a beautiful river and you could just walk down there, and it was a very wonderful place to swim. It's also a very, very famous trout fishing place. And this is what it looks like many years later. It's a very, very beautiful place. And in front of my house, I'm pleased to have rocks that I've taken from there that I treasure as geological memory. Of course, later on, people did realize you had to build the amenities, and this is a swimming pool at a small bungalow colony. And this is a place where you had maybe 20 bungalows at most, and you could gather all the people around and take a picture of them having a good time at this place. The Boris family had a little place in Glen Wild, also very, very modest. Usually they were wood, sometimes they were stucco, but you get a sense of how small these were. And here you've got people living for 2 months. When you rent a bungalow, you have it for July and August, and you've got everybody in there. You have mom and dad, an average of 2 kids, at least 1 grandparent, and whatever relatives happen to be driving up. We just took a drive for the day, it's late, maybe we'll stay and have a little food with you. And it's so late, why don't you just sleep over? So people are snoring all the time in these little places. Sometimes they were very, very rustic. In this case, you see at the Chandelier camp in Livingston Manor, they don't even have full walls. They have kind of canvas walls. And this was a place that really catered to the young crowd. And this was a kind of singles and young couples bungalow colony. And they were happy to be half outdoors. It was a very inexpensive way to go. Here you have the contract for the Excelsior Lodge. And this was a very inexpensive deal. So for 2 months, you only paid $1,000 in the middle of the 1970s. Not a very bad way to go. My father, 1 year, worked running a concession at this bungalow colony. The SGS bungalows later became a frum place called Cayman's, but we always gravitated to the hotels. The bungalow colonies also wanted to sell you food, so they had a store. This is Shapiro's bungalow colony in Conneaga Lake, across the lake from White Lake. And we stayed with them once for a few weeks while we were looking for jobs. It was one of those years neither of my parents had a job lined up, so we had to stay there. 1973, the Catskills are really starting to decline. Many hotels closing up. But as late as 1973, the Monticello Bungalow Association has enough business that they can send you to all these places. In one town alone, Monticello, you could go to either office. At the north end of town and the south end of town, the Bungalow Association could staff an office to send people to bungalows. Because we had, at this point in time, over 500 bungalow colonies and maybe over 500 hotels as well. So that's one story, the bungalow colonies. The other story is the hotels. They too started small. Some of you may recognize this place. It later became more well-known, but a couple came over from the old country, Selig and Malka, and maybe the name will become familiar. The last name is Grossinger. And this is what started Grossinger's Hotel, which was, after the Concord, the largest in the Catskills. But some of the hotels that would later become very large started fairly small, like the Waldemere. This is already kind of big as a small hotel, but it becomes much, much larger. Or the Evans in Loch Sheldrake begins very small, and you could see it's a building that they just sort of added on little rooms to the side continuously. And not that many years later, if you look at it from the air, it's much, much bigger. So some of these places did well and they expanded. This is the Ratner. Most of you have never heard of it as the Ratner because it later changed name to the Raleigh. Again, now let's go back to our architecture lesson. This looks like my parents' hotel, except it's sort of blown up. It's much larger, but it's got that same kind of porch. It's got the fanlight windows. It's got the gables. It's got the stucco front. It's got those little rooms off on the side. And it's just a bigger version of what my parents' hotel was. And here, Kutcher's Hotel, also from the air, you know, looking at that main building in the middle, right by the lake, and other buildings around it that just grow up. Eventually, they will become, they'll all disappear as we have much more modern buildings taking over. Here's another example, a Civil War era farmhouse in Greenfield Park, right near the Seven Gables. They did very well taking in boarders here, and they decided they would tear it down, build from scratch. And they thought this was a gigantic hotel, the Maple Courts. And again, you see that beautiful design of the center gable, the little rooms on the side. Very, very classic Catskills mission style, we call it. The other style I mentioned before was fake Tudor. This was the Carmel Hotel. I worked here several seasons, and in the late 50s and early 60s, a lot of hotels realized that they had to expand, and they put on these fronts. Now, if you would step back a little bit further, you'd be able to see that indeed the top of the old building is still there. This is all just a modern front on the old building. And you've got some little fancy 50s modern designs with a little carport thing here. But here's the big killer, the indoor pool. They thought that they needed to have an indoor pool to get more clientele. But the truth is, by now, the hotel's guests are aging and they don't even swim in the outdoor pool, much less the indoor pool. So the staff go there all the time, but the guests don't. And they're on the hook for a big mortgage. This later became a very well-known theater camp, Stage Door Manor. And you know, very famous people like Richard Dreyfuss would even send his kid to learn theater in this place. It was very, very well known. Some of the places were large even for their days, and the ownership changed a lot. So Charles Brown, who later with Lillian would have Charles and Lillian Brown's Hotel, actually, worked with the Merle family when they ran the Ambassador here for a while too. So there was a lot of constant changing, going back and forth as to who owned places. The Flagler, another very, very big early hotel. And the Brickman, okay, again, that beautiful look I'm talking about. I love those side rooms, the front porch going up there, the gables, the fanlight windows, all of this. This is the Brickman's when it first starts. And this is the Brickman's later. So instead of that old main building, we now have this really, really big modern main building, and some of the old buildings are still on the side. When I worked as a waiter here, the staff quarters that we stayed in were better than the guest rooms at small hotels. This was a place so big that it had many tennis courts, including clay. It had not just one, but two baseball courts. And it was, quite a big place. So we're now talking about hotels that are ranging 500, 600 guests. And now we're talking about real aerials. We're talking about people with enough money to hire planes to go up and take photographs. And if we went up high enough, we would see not just the Rickmans, but the Windsor and the Gilberts and a large bungalow colony in the foreground that probably had about 80 or 100 bungalows. So we're now talking about much, much bigger places. And again, if we look from the air, we see the Pines. Here we see Laurels on Sackett Lake. And the Concord. The Concord is the biggest, but it's also the only hotel that never looked like an original hotel. It always looked like it started out as a bunch of big apartment buildings. This is the Shawanga Lodge. This was in much closer to the city, right off of Route 17, a little further away from the hustle and bustle, still in Ulster County. It had some nice features like an outdoor amphitheater at the bottom for entertainment. Unlike other hotels that started out as Jewish boarding homes that became larger or that started from scratch as Jewish hotels, this was a Gentile hotel. And when the Jews bought this hotel, they looked at the brochure and they said, it's a gorgeous brochure. The only problem is it says no Hebrews allowed. And they were able to go to the printer, and these were old metal plates, and they could, etch out with acid, and they could just sort of reprint their brochure. It was affectionately called Schwenger Lodge because it was a very singles-oriented place, and Schwenger means pregnant in Yiddish. My parents and I, as I said before, gravitated to smaller places like the Greenwood Inn in Ellenville. I worked there once. The Majestic, another smaller place. One of the things you begin to notice is that people are putting, at least on their postcards, with pride, the ownership. So here we have Philip Conan Sons. Or sometimes we name places after ourselves, like the Dan family and the Bee, and they come together and they have the Dan Bee. And we have Cantor and Cone put together the Canco Inn from their name. Here's the Peckler. I don't know why I like this particular photo, but just because it's so different in shape from the others. It's this melange of the Tudor and the Mission style, and it just looks out of scale. But literally just 2 days ago, somebody called me and said, I think my parents owned this years ago. Do you have any information about it? And I said, no, I don't, but somebody will someday. Look at that little garden with the white rocks, that classic thing I mentioned before. The Park Manor, Abe Gutton, proprietor, great pride of ownership. Well, I said to you before we were going to look a little bit about Alfred Landis, the great postcard artist, because he made so many of these early postcards. He had a lot of license, not just to put in buildings that didn't exist there, but to actually write on top of buildings what they were. So this was the New Ritz. He put on top. Here's the day camp. Now, these were not on the roofs of the buildings. The casino didn't say casino on the side, but Landis was a very self-assured artist, and he said, I'm going to do whatever I want to do, and people love these postcards, and I'll make them. And they're quite beautiful, and they're real collector's items these days. On our website, we have a beautiful collection of them. Here's another one, the Embassy Hotel, Goldberg's in Loch Sheldrake, a little bit bigger than the others you're seeing. Package deal. Landis would do the drawing, and he would give you a watercolor painting to hang in the lobby as well as the postcards. And this is what he did with the Hollywood Country Club. A very, very beautiful piece that he did in Livingston Manor. And look at that, and you see in the next slide the postcard version of it. All right. pretty similar. The building on the left isn't here yet. Okay, I'm not sure if it ever was, but some similarity. Very few people did this because he charged you a bunch of money. But there's a collection of about 4 or 5 of these in the Sullivan County Historical Society in Hurleyville. So back to that fake Tudor style. I put this up here because the son of the Delmar owners, the Jacobs, Jerry Jacobs, had an article in my second book, and like me is also a sociologist of about the same age. And he had worked in his family's hotel for a long time, then decided to go off and get a PhD in sociology. And after he was done, his parents said to him, Mazel tov, so now you're going to come back and help in the hotel. And he said, Mom, Dad, that's the idea. I couldn't do this. I saw how much it took out of your life. You worked 7 days a week, 18 hours a day. How could you possibly expect me to do this? And this was what happened. You couldn't perpetuate this kind of small business into the next generation. And these postcards actually tell a story because you've got this posed young couple in the foreground, but you also have none of the older people in the pool. And it's actually not a very good idea business-wise to have such a postcard because it doesn't lend itself to playing and having fun. It lends itself to like we're sitting around watching, but we're not doing. So it wasn't just that they built hotels and bungalow colonies, but wherever they went, they built shuls. And this is the White Lake Shul. It's a very, very beautiful place. I think it's the most beautiful of all of them in the Catskills. And this is my friend Erwin Richmond. You'll see him in front of another shul in a few slides going in there. This was the one you saw on the front of the book, the Jewish Farmer's Book. And the door of it, it's artistically beautiful. It actually has some Sephardic elements if you look at the Magen David on top. This is a larger one. This was the Livingston Manor Shul. Pretty imposing, compared to the other one. This is the Loch Sheldrake Shul, and interior shot, quite elegant. And this is the Hebrew congregation of Loch Sheldrake. There's my friend Erwin Richmond again, who wrote a book on the bungalow colonies of the Catskills, back to our specialty area. Beautiful stained glass windows. And our Catskills Institute helped to get this on the National Register of Historic Places. The front door of it is just exquisite, hammered copper and other metals. Some shuls were a lot more ramshackle. This one in Greenfield Park. This is the congregation on Glen Wild, and it is literally across the street from the old Gerson boarding home, which was the first Jewish boarding home in the Catskills. And was bought about 10 years ago by somebody who turned it into a local museum. So this is the Shulen Mountaindale. And again, we're talking about that Catskills mission architecture. Why was it called Catskills Mission? Because people said it looked like the mission style of California missions, Catholic missions in California. But indeed not. It was based on the Polish wooden synagogues of the 18th century. So look at that front. That's what the fronts looked like on so many of these shuls. And it was used not just to build Catskills hotels, but the 72nd Street stop on the IRT on the Broadway line. Anyway, we've gotten up there on the hack. We're settled into the hotel. We know where the local shul is if we want to go. In fact, there'll be services at the hotel. But now we're going to sit down in the dining room here at the Windsor Hotel, a beautiful, elegant dining room. And this is where people came to eat the mammoth meals full of Jewish favorites, what one hotel owner's son termed a celebration of abundance. And this really started from the domestic production. And Murray Posner, who was one of the owners of Brickman, said, when I interviewed him, you didn't come to a hotel. You didn't come to a resort. You came to our house. You came to our family, and they treated you like family. And it didn't matter if you wanted another potato because we grew them here. We grew the corn, we made the cheese, we made our own butter, and the cows were giving us milk twice a day. We could make all the butter and sour cream and milk and sweet cream and everything you needed. So we served with a full hand because that's what people came up here for. Some places were less elegant, like the Jockey Club with linoleum floor. Chairs were not wrought iron as beautiful. But the menus were always elegant and so many things to choose from. And it wasn't like you chose one or two of these things for breakfast. You had one from each group. You had the fruit, you had the appetizer, then the cereal, then the eggs or the pancakes, and then you had something else on the side. And for lunch, more of the same. You'll have a little bit of each. You don't know what you want, the waiter says, I'll bring you 2 or 3 things. And now we start to also see the day's events, of which there are endless things to do. And then at night, again, Zeiger's El Dorado in South Fallsburg, here's their menu. If I do write another book, it's going to be called The Catskills on 5 meals a day. Well, make that 6 meals a day, because we've got breakfast, we've got lunch and dinner. In between, we're at the pool, we're hungry, we go to the concession. After the show, we go to the coffee shop. This is the coffee shop at the Windsor. Look at how the chairs are the same design as the dining room. And then we have another late snack. And then, of course, we're so excited and energized by the day and the evening's entertainment. It's too early to go to sleep. Let's take a drive into town. We'll go to Kaplan's in Monticello. We'll go to Singer's in Liberty. We'll go to Herbie's in Loch Sheldrake and have our 6th meal of the day. And who is serving? People like me, people like this crew. Very rare, but this was the entire dining room staff at Kutcher's in 1956. We don't usually have these photos because the owners saw no reason to bring the staff together and make photos like this. And young, hustling waiters like this guy carrying 16 mains on a tray, which was illegal. If the steward saw you at the door of the kitchen, he would make you stop and take 4 of those down. And you would start to bemoan the fact and say, if I don't take out 16, I don't serve 2 tables of 8 together, and someone's going to be complaining, how come they got theirs first and I have to wait? Everybody worked their way up. Here's a chauffeur that you may recognize, a rather bellhop you may recognize. He is giving the keys or taking the keys from a man dressed in what he thought was a very stylish summer outfit. He's about twice the height of his guest. During the day, he will be a bellhop here, and you hopefully by now recognize him. That's Wilt Chamberlain, and he will be putting on his Kutcher's t-shirt, and he will be working alongside other bellhops, waiters, and busboys from Kutcher's, playing other hotels in a very famous inter-hotel league where all the great college stars of the day were playing. Entertainment, well, we're getting close to Pesach, so let's look at what the greatest is giving us here. Music by Dave Tarras and Orchestra. If you know klezmer music, you will know that Dave Tarras was one of the 2 great musicians who really brought klezmer to the United States and made it famous. And at a very modest hotel like the greatest in Kiamish Lake, you could hear him. But you could also hear Latin bands, because the Latin dance craze was very, very powerful in the Catskills. And here you have Emilio Reyes and his band. You even have records like La Plata Sextet swings at the Raleigh Hotel. In the modest hotels, we have entertainment at the casinos where we simply set up folding wooden chairs. This is the example of what such a place looks like from the outside. This is the nightclub at the Lake House, which was still running a few years ago as a very orthodox place. And sometimes the postcards would even feature these casinos. Some of them, like this one, built to look like the main hotel building. And as the hotels got bigger, like the Olympic in South Fallsburg, they would become much larger and they would look more like nightclubs. In this case, the nightclub of a larger hotel. Let me see, which hotel was this? Anybody want to guess? This was the Evans Loch Sheldrake. Well, it wasn't very easy to run these big hotels because you had to entertain everybody. You had to hustle. You had to provide when things were scarce. You had tumblers who would run through the dining room carrying on. You had Danny Kaye literally chasing entertainers through the dining room with a cleaver in his hand. And when the kitchen was running late and they couldn't open in time and the guests were clamoring at the door from the lobby, they would keep trying to figure out ways to keep the guests from coming in. But what happens if you're actually in the dining room already and the kitchen was running late and they weren't ready to start serving the next course? So a family member tells me this delightful story. At the Grand, the orchestra played in the dining room. A march shepherded the guests in when the doors opened, and background music entertained them through the meal. It was usually on Sundays that the orchestra was called upon when the kitchen fell behind. The orchestra would play the Star-Spangled Banner, usually between the soup and the main dish course, and the guests would stand in respect. As soon as they sat down, the band would play Hatikva, and the guests would again stand. This would give the kitchen maybe 5 or 10 more minutes to catch up. And of course, after many years, the guests became wise and realized what happened when the orchestra started to play the Star-Spangled Banner. Or other stories like my friend Dorothy Eagle, who ran the Pine View in Loch Sheldrake. A guest comes and wants a room. She says, I can give you a room, but it doesn't have a private bath. The person says, I don't want to have to share a bath with somebody else. And she says, look, I'm going to have the busboy come bring us some schnapps. We'll drink. Let me tell you something. At night, when all the lights are out, the bathroom is very private. You should just be happy, come stay with me. These were the kinds of things that the little hotels did to keep life going. But it was a system that couldn't last forever. And what we see today are the remnants. So the ultra-Orthodox have taken over most of what's left. And we don't always know what's to surprise us. Weiss's Hamish Kitchen in Fallsburg. This was a bungalow colony. Fialkovs became Orthodox. Some of the best rugloch in the Catskills, really delicious. Sometimes the hotel or the bungalow colony would tell you what the history was, but they often didn't know. I like this because they tell you formerly Pine Hill Cottages. And if you get lost in between places, you can always look at the sign and find your nearest mikveh. A lot of these places became recycled. The Worrell Park Hotel becomes the Yeshiva Zichron Moshe. The Klein's Hillside in Parksville becomes Camp Gan Yisrael. The Fieldson Hotel, where my father had the concession one year in Swan Lake, becomes Camp Benos Yaakov. The Cherry Hill House, which was where I first worked full-time as a busboy when my mother was the chef for a couple of years, later became a very interesting place called Orchestra, which was a very sort of multi-denominational but Orthodox place. So you didn't have to belong to just one, either Satmar or some other group. And this is me at the tender age of 13 when I was hoisting that first bus box. This is a couple of scenes from the inside of the old casino, which was the old shul, and then they built on the bottom a brand new shul. This was the Grand Hotel in Parksville. My mother was a chef there for a couple of years. It became Daytop Village, one of the many drug rehab centers that took over. This was the Murray Hill Hotel became Dynamite Center. And this was the Green Acres Hotel that became New Hope. Well, remember I went back and showed you those Landis cards and I said, keep looking at this architecturally. What I find here are the gate posts that lead us up all the walkway to that staircase. I felt that the stone gate posts were leading us into a beautiful, elegant vacation that one would never expect. The smallest hotel would be elegant beyond our belief because it was a place that we could be. We would walk up there and we would be transported into a brand new environment. But what's left behind? Ruins, shambles, but many people who bought the old buildings when they were still standing turned them into private residences like this. And if you drive through the Catskills, this is what you will see today. People living in what look like hotels, but are now private homes. All of these are old hotel buildings. And sometimes they even still have the name on. This is a private house, but up on top it says Lakeview House, because that's what it was. It was a small boarding house. And sometimes as I would drive up to these places, I used to have a video camera and another camera for slides and another camera for still. And they didn't know what I was doing there. They thought I was a tax collector or something. They chased me away. This was the old staff quarters of a hotel that had become a private residence. Or the Hotel Israel, where I drove past many, many years. And was always just sort of falling down. And one year I saw somebody working on it. They'd bought the whole hotel and they were transforming it into a private residence. They had, dozens of acres and they had their own lake in the background. This was an old boarding house that actually was still being used as a boarding house. An old boarding house that still has a stone-fronted root cellar. Another place in Swan Lake, and a place that turned into a Korean resort. And occasionally places that would be renewed, like the Rainbow in Ellenville. Keeping some of the old beautiful things like pastel colored soda machines. Mainly you saw the ruins and the remnants. This is what you saw, the old discarded swimming pool that sometimes had weeds growing through it. Or you saw the handball court with vines growing on it. And the handball courts were important because these were the biggest places where the names of the hotel always were, or the bungalow colony. Here's the Gibbers that became Yeshiva Viznitz. And even when it was still operating as yeshiva, they weren't even using it. As you could see, they let it grow this way while they were still studying. There's the Greenwood Inn I showed you before. And the lonely faces of the bungalows looking at us, saying, please come back and stay with us. Abandoned hotels now bought by people, again, a single family living in this old hotel in Greenfield Park. Very similar style here, yet another building. Or an old hotel in the middle of Hurleyville that was just sort of sitting there, abandoned, but somehow still in good shape, even though nobody was living in it or doing anything. Or this little hotel on the side road where you turned off to Kutcher's, up on a hill, abandoned for years. Could there be renewal? Some people thought there might. In the 1960s, this postcard of glossy photochrome of the Grand Mountain Hotel in Greenfield Park shows people having a grand time at the swimming pool. Of course, years later, we fall into disrepair, the proverbial pool with the weeds and bushes growing in it. And I would drive by this year after year. And yet one year I drove by and saw this instead. And like the Rainbow Hotel in Ellenville, some Russian Jews had bought it and said, we're going to revive it. We're going to build the new Catskills. And they did. And here, the proverbial ping pong table is there and is now revived and re-inhabited by people. But mostly this is what you see, the abandoned chairs of the hotel yet to be named, because I have told you in the beginning, if you guess the name of the hotel, I will send you there all expense paid trip for Pesach for a family of 4. And this is what it was like after it closed up and before it was bought by some Haredi folks. But me, now, as I write, collect, and organize, I come back to roam country roads in search of abandoned hotels to record on film for people, many of whom will never quite understand how 500,000 people each summer came to relax in hotels and bungalows, or how their doctors and professors came to work their way through the first generation of college. My camera records dibbuks grazing in the fallen timbers of old kitchens, hotel spirits lurking in the half-moon facades of Catskills mission architecture. My tape recorder picks up from overgrown weeds the murmurs of requests for pickled lox, embraces in the staff quarters, cha-chas from champagne night in the casino. My heart logs a million desires, hopes, and dramas of every sort of East Coast Jew looking for something to make a life with. Miracles. Catskills is full of miracles. Turning little boarding homes into hotels and bungalow colonies is a miracle. Making a place for the Jewish working class to get some fresh air is a miracle. Building a summer Eden that stretched for 2 counties worth of eternity is a miracle. Think of the pleasures experienced by any one of New York's millions who first stepped onto the grounds of the Kuchelain bungalow colony or hotel and saw the cannas in the garden, smelled the fresh mown grass, heard the gurgle of the stream, smelled the brisket in the oven and the rugelach on the table. Think of the pride of ownership among hotel and bungalow colony proprietors who tended their family-style summer havens. Think of the waiters, busboys, counselors, and musicians who were so pleased to support themselves through college and the fun we all had while doing it. It's a world mostly lost to us physically, yet so powerful in our memories and emotions. I hope my words will return you to the places and times where this all happened. Welcome back to the mountains.
Folks, can you hear me?
Yeah, the sound is on. It was off for a second, but it's back on.
Okay, folks, are the 355 of you still there?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, great. Well, this was extraordinary. I too have my stories going up to Evans Kayamisha Hotel for Pesach with my family from Brooklyn for 4 Pesachs and hanging out with the guys in the band and doing my homework and then roaming around. So we've had lots of questions, and I do hope, Jerry, that we can save the chat because people are connecting and they'll want to keep in touch with each other, and the memories are extraordinary. So let me ask, we have a sociologist before us. There are questions about the hierarchy of the hotels and the status among them. And what kind of disputes did the hotels have amongst them? And what kind of collaboration? There's that whole area of labor and employer. So talk a little bit about these economic and social divides.
So those are kind of 2 separable questions. So let's hold off on the labor one for another second. But there was a hierarchy. Of course, the big hotels like Concord and Grossinger's, we're talking about, 1,100, 1,300 guests. The next size down, called the medium, large medium, the Nemeris and the Windsor, the Brickmans, 500, 600. Then smaller places, like the Carmel that could have 250, and some smaller places that had maybe 50 or 60. And everybody felt that, the bigger you got, the better you got. In my book, Catskills Culture, I've got a whole chapter on the Schlock House. And what you look down on if you were in the better places was the Schlock House, where they served family style, one platter of each thing on the front of the table. And everything was done that way. The entertainment was much less fancy and beautiful, and the accommodations were much less. So every hotel thought they were better than the rest. They were all competing. Our pool is better than the others. Why would you want to go down the road to Schwartz's when you could stay here? Of course, the bungalow colonies were looked down upon by all the hotel people because they were too poor to afford a hotel, which wasn't really true. They just liked the bungalow colonies better. Yes, in some ways it was more economical. But everybody snuck into the next best place. The bungalow colony people snuck into the small hotels, the small hotel people snuck into the medium hotels, etc. So, and this was bragging rights. Like, we got into the concrete, we went through the back way, we parked our car down, on the country road, we broke through the fence, whatever. So there was definitely that kind of hierarchy. And people felt, as they did better in life, as they made more money, that it was important for them to go to a better place where they would dress up more. And that was something that was always very visible. So that's separate from the labor question. We've had talks at our Catskills conference about that. There were labor organizers, there were unions and attempted unions, and the hotels didn't like that. It was not a very friendly milieu, and even some of the hotels who would see themselves as fairly progressive, liberal-minded people could not imagine having a union that would start to dictate to them, because they were running a family-style hotel, and they felt like they were going to really be in charge of how people worked and how they dressed and where they slept and who they went out with or didn't go out with. And the unions were not looked upon very well. Henry Foner, who died a few years ago, was a great historian of this. He was a labor organizer for many years for the furriers, and he talked about this and wrote about this. So yeah, the steam laundry once organized, that was one of the few successful ones, but none of the hotels actually ever saw a successful union drive.
Okay, we've had several questions, not surprising, about entertainers and entertainment, and many careers began and many connections were made. So say a bit about that. This was a stellar aspect of the Catskills for many, coming up from Brooklyn and the Bronx and Queens.
It was, and it was a place where people often launched their careers. This was, Las Vegas would later become a kind of launching post, just like taking a new theater piece to New Haven or to Boston before it opened on Broadway. And a lot of places, would bring up unknown talent that would later become very well known. More interesting, actually, was the history of the places that had their own on-staff entertainment. If people have read Marjorie Morningstar or seen the film Marjorie Morningstar, that was the very classic earlier tradition in the 20s, 30s, and 40s, where they would have people who actually did the writing and did the entertaining and performing. And they would literally go into New York, they would sit in Broadway shows, and they would write down the music as they heard it, and they would go back and they would perform it. They would do original skits. They would, rip off comedy routines from Second Avenue. And those were the White Row Lodge was a very good example of this. So that, to me, is a lot more interesting because of that particular style. But yeah, this was the place where Jewish humor really thrived, and most American humor, we could say, grew out of the Jewish comedians and some of the Gentile comedians who worked with them up in the Catskills.
Okay, somebody asks about the origins of the term Borscht Belt.
We all hated it. It was not a thing that anyone ever called it. We didn't even call it the Catskills. If you were part of this life, you called it the mountains. Sometimes you called it the country.
Yeah.
But you didn't even call it the Catskills. It was either the mountains or the country or just the town. Like, yeah, we're going up to Fallsburg for the summer. But the Borscht Belt was something coined by journalists, and hotel owners in particular thought that it was a negative term. They thought it was perhaps anti-Semitic, but even if not anti-Semitic, that it was a degrading term, as if we were just freshers, that all we did was come up there to eat.
Okay. Somebody asks and uses the term the Irish Catskills. Does this have any resonance for you?
There were several sections of the Catskills. There was an Irish Catskills, there was an Italian Catskills, and usually these were further up a little in the western part of Sullivan County and the northern part of Ulster County. And there would just be a handful of each of these places. Villa Roma in Callicoon, up in the northwestern ranges of Sullivan County, was a well-known Italian place. But there were never that many of them. There were a handful of Gentile Ukrainian places in Ulster County too. And then, even within the Jewish culture, there were different sectors. So in the upper reaches of Ulster County, in Tannersville and Fleischmann's, you had Germans and Hungarians. And if you've ever read Abe Kahan, you learn that when you went up there, they spoke German. They didn't speak Yiddish. And if you spoke Yiddish up there, you were looked upon in a very disdainful term, because just like the Yekis, the German Jews, always looked down upon the new immigrants coming over in the turn of the century and right after. They didn't want them up there, dirtying the wealthier German resorts, German Jewish resorts in that area.
Okay, we saw that extraordinary photo of Wilt, the stilt, as one of our correspondents here reminds us. Say a bit about the role of African Americans in this world. Were people there working in terms of maintenance, in terms of working in a whole array of roles in the kitchen, on the grounds? What did you learn about that world?
Well, so there's a lot of different parts of this. I grew up in Florida. I grew up in segregated neighborhoods and segregated schools. And when we would go up to the Catskills in May for Decoration Day, I would be pulled out of school and I would finish my schooling either in Ellenville or in Monticello. And not only were there Black kids in classes, there were Black teachers.
Ah.
And, I grew up in a family, that was activist. My mother was very involved in American Jewish Congress and desegregation and anti-school prayer activities. And I was very involved in the Congress of Racial Equality when I was in high school. And I learned this because of growing up in my family, but also because in the Catskills, Black and white ate together. They slept in the same staff quarters. They ate in the same staff dining room. And when Black entertainers came, like any white entertainer, they were served a pre-show meal in the main dining room at the staff table. So it was a very desegregated place. This is not to say that there wasn't racism among white Jews, because there was, as there is with any white people. But I learned so much by being in this milieu, by seeing it in practice, that Black and white people were living and working together. There was also a very famous resort called Peg Leg Bates Country Club in Accord, and this was out towards Ulster County, the easternmost reaches, halfway between Ellenville and Kingston. And it was one of the only all-Black places, and actually a very famous place for civil rights groups to meet. And Southern Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee actually had a very famous conference there when they started their Black Power campaign. It was launched at Peg Leg Bates Country Club. A lot of Blacks worked in the hotels, not typically in the dining room, but sometimes. They were a large part of the kitchen staff, and they were definitely a large part of the grounds crew. The grounds crew, in terms of labor, were treated pretty poorly. They were often alcoholics, and they were treated shabbily, and they were sometimes brought in from the Bowery by the carload, taken up to the employment agencies, where they were then shipped out to the hotels. They were paid a pittance. They would get their money, they would get drunk, and then they would disappear. So there was always a big labor problem, a lot of unfair treatment. But a white dishwasher and a black dishwasher were equally seen, as poor working class people, rather than as a black person to be treated differently. So yeah, of course there was racism, but as I say, it was a very integrated environment.
Okay, here's another question which you could discuss for a long time. You talked about the heyday, the 50s and the 60s, and then you start talking about a decline, and sometimes there is a little bit of a resurrection, but things are not what they once were. So some folks would like to know some of the causes for the decline of the Catskills. And then before you answer, somebody pipes up that they've heard that gambling might return, and could this be a recharging of the area?
Well, gambling is there already, but this is not going to save anything. People thought this for years. What has happened in the Catskills is that a lot of Orthodox have bought up old places, and there are actually new housing developments in some places that are aimed at the Orthodox. But it will never be a big resort area. There are certain things that are just cultural phenomena of certain time, and they won't exist anymore. Just like there were mini Catskills in New Jersey and in Moodus, Connecticut, and other places, they're not going to come back. The 50s and 60s were the heyday, and a lot of things happened. I'll try to run by very quickly. By the beginning of the 1960s, virtually all Jews married other Jews. By the end of that decade, we're getting to about 50% intermarriage. This is not necessarily a comfortable place for an intermarried couple to be. People are less concerned about kosher meals. They're starting to be concerned more about healthy meals and not eating those 6 meals a day I talked about. The Jews are not only living in New York and environs, they are moving to what Deborah Dash Moore called the Golden Cities, to LA and to Miami. And they have a year-round vacation. They don't need to come up to the Catskills. People who would never dream of going to Europe because they just escaped the Nazis, or their relatives or their friends had, or the Jewish people as a whole had, they now see their kids as college students going to Europe, and they say, the Nazis are gone, we can go to Europe. The cruise business starts, modeled after the all-inclusive Catskills vacation. People start to go on cruises to the Caribbean. And the old hotels, especially the small ones that could never modernize, were just not satisfactory. The rooms were really small. We're talking about a family of 4 living in a room that's like a 9 by 12, maybe 10 by 14 room for weeks on end without necessarily a bathroom. They have to share a bathroom with 5 or 6 other families on that floor at the end of the hall. They don't want that kind of thing. They aren't living in extended families. Mom and pop, used to say, we'll find you a place to live nearby a few streets over. Well, now people are moving away. They've got careers, they go elsewhere. And so it doesn't draw on the same clientele anymore. And the original people who went there, and even their children, are now getting old and dying. So these are all, these various phenomena that lead to the decline.
Okay, someone named Mike Kotler has written a little essay at one point about the demise of the Borscht Belt. And when we share this, Jerry, I think people will enjoy reading that. Here's a comparative question. You mentioned the extraordinary lure that the Catskills had for 500,000 people coming up at a certain point during summers. Were there any equivalents of that? Maybe not 500,000 on the West Coast. There became a concentration of Jewish people in the LA area, in the Chicago area. Were there any resort areas that lured Jewish people in some sense like the Catskills?
In the Midwest, there were some places in Michigan, but we're talking about a handful of hotels. And again, that was also true of Moodus, Connecticut, and some of the nearby towns there, and some of the places in New Jersey. But there was never anything that looked like the Catskills in terms of a spread. We're talking about, being able to drive 20 miles in any direction and never be out of sight of several hotels and several bungalow colonies. There's nothing ever as big as that.
Okay. In terms of the changes in the demographics, you mentioned the earlier days of the area where there were churches and resorts that catered to non-Jewish people. Were there tensions when more and more Jewish people began to move in between the Christian community and the Jewish community?
Well, there were. I mean, even in the 1950s, there was a Klan chapter in Ulster County, and they actually held rallies and cross burnings. And they threatened, but I don't know if they ever attacked or beat up Jews, but they definitely threatened them by their presence. And there was definitely a lot of anti-Semitism there. Some of the towns became Jewish majority towns. And so that really made people feel a lot safer. So you took a place like, I think Mountaindale was an example of the population year round was a majority Jewish. But there were definitely anti-Semitic practices in terms of banks wouldn't loan as readily. When the Jewish farmers first started, they had to develop their own insurance cooperatives and their own egg cooperatives and dairy cooperatives because they couldn't always get credit, partly because they were not always great credit risk, but partly because they were Jewish.
Okay, we're coming to the end, and this has been extraordinarily rich, as you'll see when you see the chats. There are a number of questions about a museum of the Catskills. It sounds like there are some initiatives along these lines. Can you say some more?
Well, there have been many attempts over the years. There is a group now that some of you may see emails from. They are trying to raise money. Jack Godfrey is, I think, the main person there. It's taken a long time. I don't know what's going to become of it. I hope something will. I had tried years ago to get a very rich business person up there who made a lot of money off a local location to fund such a museum, and had no such luck. It would be a great thing to do. I mean, my fantasy would be that a rich donor would give our Catskills Institute tens of millions of dollars, and we would get one of these few buildings that really is still standing and revive it and have it as a living museum. Eileen Pollock's book, one of the great novels of the Catskills called Paradise, New York, actually has this in its plot, where a late in life Catskills resort starts to bring an anthropologist in, and they bring people to experience what the Catskills used to be like. And when she first met me, she said, "I dreamed you up." This is really a sociologist, not an anthropologist, who's doing this. So yeah, I hope it'll happen. I haven't seen it happen yet, but I welcome any effort to preserve these traditions. And of course, that's another way of me saying it once again. Many of you have photographs, many of you have tchotchkes. Send those. We will use those for our archives. Write stories. Send whatever you have, and we'll be really eager to have it.
Okay, these are wonderful words to end on, and I'm sure some of you will reach out to Phil. And if some of you have $1 million in your pocket, I'm sure that Phil can find good use for that. Let's go to Jerry, who will have some final words.